that you've heard covered, but we don't often hear people with academic expertise covering this topic. I mean, I think to a degree I have that, but what about the issue of transhumanism as an academic discipline, as a study? Today I have one of my good buddies as the guest with me. His name is David Patrick Harry. You can find him on Twitter under that, as well as on YouTube under Church of the Eternal Logos. And David, I want to talk to you about transhumanism because this is a subject that you know very well. I think you're studying this at the academic level. Before we get into it, I'm going to let you give your take on it. What I understand is kind of an agenda that we have been under for many decades. We can go back to people like H.G. Wells, who wrote a book called The New World Order, The Open Conspiracy, Bertrand Russell, other people in those circles. They said they wanted to go back to Plato, utilize Plato's philosophy of techne, and make it into a technocracy, a world government ruled not by nation states, not by firewalls of the family and borders, but rather a global federation of world citizens where nobody has identity other than what the system gives you ultimately by some sort of matrix, some sort of thing to be plugged into. And as we progress up into the future, beyond the designs of people 100 plus years ago, we see books like Between Two Ages by Brzezinski, outlining this world government. We see that's run by technocracy. The book is called The Technotronic Era. We see people like Jacques Attali, the Kissinger of France, writing books about transhumanists as the tip of the spear of the revolution. We find people like Klaus writing books like The Fourth Industrial Revolution, where he talks about how we're going to be linked into Skynet. We see his understudy, Noah Yuval Harari, basically saying the same type of stuff. What is transhumanism? Does it have a predecessor in the ancient Gnostic cults and mystery religions? And is it kind of ultimately something Gnostic?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jay. I really appreciate the opportunity. And this is a topic that I've been really concerned with and is the primary focus of my academic research. And as you highlighted, we have a lot of conversation, and you do incredible work talking about many of the globalist elite books and the technocracy and how transhumanism fits into that. But what I think most people aren't aware of is that the sort of philosophical presuppositions that give and undergird transhumanist philosophy in the contemporary period actually have pretty old roots. And I would argue that you can look back to early philosophers like John Scotus Erigena. He was an Irish Neoplatonic Christian, deemed heretic by the church, but he was considered one of the leading philosophers of the Carolingian era. And in the 800s, he talked about this new concept of the useful arts as redeeming the abilities that were lost to Adam due to the fall. And so what's interesting, and a handful of scholars have made this argument, and I actually agree with it, that transhumanism and transhumanist philosophy actually emerges out of heretical belief systems within Christianity, specifically Western Christianity. And that from the scholastic period forward, this idea that technology and technological or mechanical means are going to divinize man and regain total universal knowledge over nature, which they believed Adam had before the fall, is therefore us moving back to the New Jerusalem. And this is generally characterized as a millenarian perspective, as opposed to a more traditional Christian perspective would be more of an apocalyptic, and that would ebb and flow. There'd be good and bad periods throughout history, but ultimately the eschatological vision of traditional Christianity is that things are going to get worse in one sense or another, where many of these heretical views that we can see move through the scholastic period through people like Giacomo Fiore, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in just a few, about why he is so influential. Roger Bacon, moving into people like Paracelsus, the alchemist, Henry Cornelius Agrippa, moving into somebody like Francis Bacon, who also wrote a book called The New Atlantis. And after the Reformation period, there was this energy that was really characterizing Protestant Northern European ideas that was sort of blending Hermetic ideas Western esoteric ideals with Protestant Christianity, and undergirded by this belief in technological progress, which ultimately is going to lead towards the transcendence of man and go to the New Jerusalem. And so much of the 16th century and the 17th century was characterized by this Enlightenment utopian thinking that we were going to redeem ourselves through technology. And I would argue, and even Nick Bostrom, we'll talk a little bit about, he's one of the leading current philosophers of transhumanism. He has an article on the history of transhumanism, and he even highlights that many of the aspirations of transhumanism actually comes out of Western esoteric alchemy. But yeah, I think we could make a strong argument that it even emerges before that.
Yeah, I like the tie in there. I was going to bring up Hermeticism. There's a famous book by Dame Frances Yates on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and she highlights the beginning of that book, the philosophy of, say, John Dee, right, the first 007. Mm-hmm. John Dee was very interested in the notion of man achieving apotheosis through ritual magic. And a lot of the esoteric stuff that you're talking about, that we think about today, comes out of this tradition of Hermeticism, and even scientism itself actually has a lot of its origin in the Hermetic tradition of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Many of the famous scientists were involved in these esoteric lodges where they could conduct alchemy. Newton was a famous alchemist. Most people don't know this. Right. And it ties in as well with the rise of Marxism and socialism, because a lot of the groups that you're talking about, Joachim Fior and his radical Franciscan philosophy, it was a very immanentizing of the eschaton, and that's just a fancy word for saying we can bring the kingdom of God into time and space through human works, create a kind of human kingdom of God. And later groups picked up on this idea. Thomas Müntzer and the Müntzer Rebellion was an earlier, the next phase of a kind of socialism. And as we get up into the period of Marx himself has a very technocratic bent in his writings. He thinks that technology could be the key to the creation of what would, quote, liberate man and bring about the utopian state. We see this in other philosophers after Marx who also speak this way. And then we get into the technocrats, and they share this idea. But like you said, it goes back to the ancient world of the idea of creating an ideal world, an ideal government. But it also wants to transform man. And I think when we mention Gnosticism, why do you think they want to transform man? Is it something like out of the Garden of Eden, like the promise of that, you can be like God, you can be your own God? It almost sounds like that.
Yeah, I would argue, again, coming at it as an Orthodox Christian, that it really is this sort of misinterpretation of Scripture, be it Genesis 3, but really many of the thinkers throughout history that I would highlight regarding this trajectory of transhumanist undergirded presuppositions, all believe in this linear progress that technology and rational apprehension of nature is what's going to transcend man. And the traditional Christian understanding is the way that we unite with God is through a moral behavior, a moral living of our lives that reflects the teachings of Jesus Christ. And it's through that embodiment of the teachings of Christ and the uncreated energies as an Orthodox Christian that we become synergized by God. But this worldview is specifically about, you could argue it has Gnostic elements because of this emphasis on the rational apprehension of knowledge, which when we move into the 21st century with somebody like Yuval Noah Harari and his philosophy of Dataism, which I would argue is a central core to transhumanist philosophy, he actually argues in favor of philosophy Dataism, where the only thing that truly exists in the world is information. And therefore, the only thing that's important is the ability to process and cipher information. And he makes the claim towards the end of that book, Homo Deus, that we are just algorithms and everything that's living is an algorithm. And therefore, there is no real ontological distinction between a digital or computerly generated algorithm and us as biological entities. And the only thing that's important then is how much can we process. And therefore, if you are upgraded with hardware in your brain, or essentially totally transcend human nature through transhumanism, that you are going to be at an ontologically a higher state than you could ever be as a human entity. And that really is Gnostic in the sense that, one, it's a transcendent of nature. For them, it's part of their post-evolutionary philosophy. But it's that focus on rational apprehension, I think, is something that can't be underappreciated, that it really stems out of spiritual ideas. And when we look at the 20th century with somebody like Arthur C. Clarke and his famous quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, my research is really focused in the realm of new religious movements and Western esoteric traditions. And I would argue that transhumanism is a new religious movement. It sort of challenges the categories of what religion is, but it's built on many presuppositions, despite transhumanists now would say, oh, we're atheists, we're rationalists. We don't, have any sort of spiritual worldview. But in fact, I would say that they do. And these are ancient roots. And Giacomo Fiore, as you mentioned, was an abbot who believed that there was these sort of three different ages that reflected the Trinity. There was the age of the Father, which was the Old Testament, the age of the Son, which was the incarnation of Christ. And then he believed, as most people do, that in his life, then they entered into the age of the Holy Spirit. So he just happened to be at the precipice, and that this age of the Holy Spirit then was all about the regeneration of man back to the Edenic state, and that technology and knowledge are the ways in which that occurs. And when we look at somebody like Roger Bacon, who was also an English Franciscan friar, we see the exact same thing. And there's many legends regarding Roger Bacon. He was obviously considered an alchemist, but there's a big legend about his mechanical or necromantic brazen head that he was able to conjure, and that he could then ask the questions to this mechanical or necromantic head, and it would give him all sorts of responses. It was sort of an all-knowing entity. And it's like, well, that's in the 1300s, and we can already see a sort of precursor in what many people believe that AGI is going to be.
Yeah, the idea of a mimicked logic machine that mimics the human brain. This is the origins of modern computing. If you look at Leibniz in some of his writings, the co-founder of calculus at the same time as Newton, he has essays where he talks about the possibility of building, on the basis of his kind of Neoplatonic philosophy, a machine that mimics the logic of the human mind, and it kind of sets the stage for the rise of the computer. I think the medieval golem mythology also plays into that. There is an overlap too with medieval Kabbalah and Hermeticism and scientism that emerges out of that as well. So there's a lot of strains that go together, absolutely. And one thing you talk about a lot in your videos, and you have a channel, Church of the Eternal Logos, over on YouTube. You talk a lot about boundaries, and that men and the masculine spirit is very interested in erecting and protecting boundaries. That's part of what it is to be a man. And I appreciate that, because this is overlooked today. I just did a stream kind of piggybacking your masculinity stream. And this relates to the transhumanist stuff, because transhumanism is really about going beyond all boundaries, and it ties into the trans agenda in terms of biology, because the idea that when you're mentioning these esotericists, when we look at something like the image of Baphomet, we notice that it has both genders. And in some of the occult circles and traditions, there's this idea that to have both of the genders, or to be non-binary, to go beyond that, is to return to this original primal monadic state, which is not in any kind of division or differentiation. So, for example, to go from the original source primal monad state to male and female is somehow a fall into a lesser state of being. And they have an assumption, and you can actually read some of the esotericists and the occultists and the Crowleyans. They'll speak this well. They'll say, we need to get back to some kind of non-gendered supra state of beyond man and woman, or being both. That statue that they unveiled in one of the Nordic countries, where it was a man with genitalia having breasts feeding a baby, that is a form of the Baphomet imagery here. How does that relate to the transhumanist movement, though, and this idea of transcending boundaries?
Well, yeah, you highlight that transcendence of boundaries, or the dissolution of boundaries. Terence McKenna was famous for arguing that that's exactly what psychedelics do. And I would argue that much of, when we look at the agenda of the elites, the dissolution of national boundaries, the dissolution of boundaries between man and machine, the dissolution of boundaries between man and animal, the dissolution of boundaries between male and female, that these are actually attacks on the psyche. These are attacks on the reality of God's creation. These are attacks on our ability to logically and rationally apprehend and process reality. And if you can't see what's in front of you and understand it, well, then you're going to be very malleable by powers that be to reinterpret the phenomenon that is occurring in front of your face. And I think that's something that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, human nature is believed to be plastic. There's no such thing as natures. There's the plasticity of man, and this goes back to H.G. Wells's Island of Dr. Moreau. He was actually way ahead of the curve in this idea, because his idea was that you can sort of turn man into whatever you want him to be, because he's sort of like putty, right? And so you can mold him into the future entity that you want to be. But this is interesting because one of the flaws that I see here, new live event, we've been having a blast doing these live events all over, will be in Las Vegas, June 22nd, with our good buddy Jamie Kennedy from Scream, the Jamie Kennedy Experiment, an awesome comedian. We have a great time doing these 6-hour events. They're not, it's not just stand-up, it's not just boring lectures, it's more like a party. I know my buddy David here has been to one of our events. It's a lot of fun. It's June 22nd in Las Vegas. Head on over to my Twitter page, J Dyer Twitter. You'll see at the top there is the post, and you can go over to the Eventbrite link and get your tickets right now. June 22nd in Las Vegas. We'll also have with us our buddy Isaac Weishaupt. You've seen him on the podcast with Sam Tripoli, Temple Hat, many times. So my wife Jamie will also be there with us. 6-hour event. Be sure and get your tickets now. There's limited seating. So we're talking about this dissolution of boundaries. We're talking about weird contradictions in the worldview of transhumanism. And before the break there, I was trying to get into the point of weird, this element of, on the one hand, we want no boundaries. However, all of reality in this quantification perspective is seen to be somehow information. Well, to have information requires setting some kind of boundaries. We have this piece of information, which is distinct from this piece of information. So having and knowing information requires boundaries. Yet at the same time, we're told that there are no boundaries, and man must sort of step beyond all boundaries and somehow achieve his own divinity. And it's always based on weird fallacies, weird illogical contradictions. Klaus and Harari, for example, say that there's no such thing as consciousness. There's no such thing as the mind. However, we're going to upload the mind to the cloud. How are you going to upload something that doesn't exist? It makes no sense. Man is going to be God, of course, but man is meaningless muck from the pond scum of the ancient primordial world of the soup. So it's always a contradictory story and narrative. Yet they're selling us on this myth that technology will somehow make us into gods or Marvel Universe soy men, superheroes, right? What's the root of this in terms of what they really want? So we've talked about the ancient history, but what's the real goal of the transhumanists in your view?
Well, it depends on who you ask in regards to some of these contemporary philosophers. You know, if you look at one who is a co-founder of Humanity Plus, which is sort of the rebranding of the Transhumanist Association, the World Transhumanist Association, that was rebranded in the early 2000s as Humanity Plus by philosopher Nick Bostrom and David Pearce. And David Pearce describes himself as a negative utilitarian, and that philosophical worldview is interested in the elimination, or at least the limiting to the most significant extent, suffering. And so he is a vegan who promotes a hedonistic transhumanism, which is about the engineering, this is a direct quote, of paradise engineering. So he believes that this hedonistic transhumanism, what they're going to do through the technologies is engineer paradise. And in so doing, he goes so far as that he wants to redesign the total global ecosystem. I kid you not. And in his own writings, he would want to redesign predatory species so that they would no longer eat other animals and therefore eliminate suffering. And one of the ways in which he postulates we might be able to do that is through a brain implant. And so what would happen is when you experience suffering, this would be sort of transmutated into a sense of pleasure, but it would be the way he describes it is it would inform you that you would be suffering. It'd be a different type of stimulation, but therefore when you experience suffering, you wouldn't actually feel it. Well, from a Christian worldview, that is demonic. And we've talked about sort of providing everybody with their hedonistic desires and living in, you know, pod-like entities with their UBI, all their, you know, kibble and their There are bugs ready there to eat for them. And he's very much in favor of a utopian worldview like this, where you talk with other major transhumanist thinkers. Max Moore is really kind of considered one of the premier philosophers and founders of contemporary transhumanism. And he owns the Alcor Life Extension Foundation in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is focused on cryogenics. And so they are currently freezing human bodies right before death. So this is a sort of assisted, mediated death where they will you'll go there before you die. And he's actually recently on the Theo Von podcast talking about what they do at Alcor. And you have to obviously sign waivers. It's very expensive. And then they'll place your body in a form of liquid nitrogen, or you can just put your brain in there. So you have kind of two options. And it's been speculated. I don't know for sure. So somebody will have to fact check me. But Bill Gates and some of the elites have been very interested in cryogenics. And his wife, Natasha Vita-Moore, actually participated in an experiment at the University of Seville in Spain, where they were able to prove that there was no memory loss in multicellular organisms when they were cryonically frozen. So what they did is they froze neurons and tissues from a multicellular organism, and then were able to unfreeze it, although it's a little bit more technical, because obviously if it was just frozen in the way that we think, something in the freezer, it would the water would be a major problem for the tissues and all this different stuff. So there's a different process for it, and they're very emphatic to explain this when everybody brings it up. But what they did prove is that the memory of something before could be maintained after it was sort of resuscitated. And so the whole point of Alcor Life Extension Foundation is for what they deem and what they even describe explicitly as a form of resurrection. And that people who pay for these services, that eventually at some point in the future, whether we're able to, in their opinion, upload our brains or our minds to a computer, or be able to totally technologically augment the human entity, that they'll be able to revive somebody right on the brink of death before they're frozen, and they would be able to sort of transfer them to a new body. And this is something that they believe they're making headway in. And this is something that a lot of money is being pushed for. And when you look at their founders, it's many of the same global movers and shakers that you would suspect funding a lot of this research.
Yeah, it's just weird to me the way the thought process of a lot of these people is that, they give the appearance of being very logical and very rational and sort of almost worshiping mathematics like some sort of weird Pythagorean cult or something. And yet at the same time, if I were to say, I brought the number 7 with me, would you like to talk to him? Would you like to talk to the number 7? People would think you're insane. They think you have a mental problem. You can't talk to the number 7. And yet, when we think about what a computer is, or what AI is, it's really nothing more than a bunch of nerd code. There's no consciousness there, and yet they'll treat, well, if we just put more nerd code in there, eventually it'll it's like a magical thinking, right? If you like more algorithms somehow equate to consciousness. And I recently did a lecture on Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, which is a sequel to Alice in Wonderland. And we went really deep into the philosophy of that book. He was a mathematician, and in certain ways, I think some of his thought sort of presages where we are now, because he was a pretty strict determinist, and he put his mathematical determinism into the Alice stories. And when you get into the later chapters of the copy that I have, there's a reprinting of what the tortoise said to Achilles. And this is a famous logic problem in the history of logic, but it overlaps with mathematics as well, because it sort of makes the point that, following upon Zeno's paradox, that you kind of can't encapsulate some things in sets or in math or in logic. And it overlaps with Gödel's incompleteness theorems, where the sets appeal outside of themselves. And the reason I bring all that up, there's a famous paper that was written some decades back, I think it's at Oxford, it's called Mind, Machines, and Gödel. And it's making the point that some of these mathematical principles and philosophical, logical principles that we're talking about, that you see in some of Lewis Carroll's writings, it kind of demonstrates the impossibility of numbers or sets ever becoming self-aware or self-conscious. It's not possible. It makes no sense. Yet so much of what we're talking about with AI and transhumanism is premised on the idea that it can just become conscious. So how do you see an overlap maybe with evolutionary philosophy and transhumanism, the idea that we're evolving, maybe even humans and robots are going to become conscious, and then we're going to meld with them like HAL in 2001 or something?
Right. I think most people in regards to that question are going to be familiar with like Werner Vinge and Ray Kurzweil's theory of the singularity, which is built on this idea that there's going to be this exponential growth of technology based on Moore's law, and that we're going to reach this sort of apex. And it really is a sort of eschatological vision of transhumanism. And this is one of the reasons why I think it really gels well with many of these medieval Renaissance Enlightenment ideas of utopia, because transhumanism does fit into that quite well. And when we, and I think it needs to be said that transhumanism, that term and the way we understand it, was actually first said by Julian Huxley. And he wrote a book in 1957 called New Bottles for New Wine, describing what he articulated as the religion without revelation. And that's what transhumanism essentially is that we no longer need to deal with revelation, because revelation is occurring through our rational apprehension of the world. But you mentioned earlier, again, this sort of dissolution of boundaries and this emphasis on unity is very much a Neoplatonic presupposition. And it's characterized throughout transhumanism because they are focused on this unifying principle. So Ray Kurzweil, for example, in his books, I believe it's The Age of Spiritual Machines, literally believes, and he promotes this idea, that we will all be interconnected and there will be essentially a global hive mind of humanity. And again, that's another dissolution of boundaries. And this is why transhumanism is so much in favor of androgyny. And they use the rhetoric because they're very, very supportive of the LGBTQ enterprise because of what they deem as bodily autonomy. And so if you can transition and you can change genders, this one shows a sort of nominal reality that these universal characteristics don't really exist and we can augment ourselves. But it also highlights this push towards doing away with traditional masculinity, as we said, is very much principally oriented around boundaries and the maintaining of boundaries, whether it be men that went to war to defend national boundaries or religious principles or the tribe itself or their wives and children. These are all boundaries to some extent in which men defend, and that's also done through ideology, that's done through religion and culture. And what we're seeing right now through multiculturalism and globalism, all these things are sort of dissolutions of boundaries to some degree or another. And post-evolutionary theory is essential to transhumanism. So I have a handful of like philosophical presuppositions that really characterize transhumanism. The first one I would say is post-secularism. And so actually the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas, who I'm not a big fan of the Frankfurt School, but Jürgen Habermas had really a great criticism of what he saw as genetic engineering and the development of CRISPR technologies and stuff like this. And he highlighted how this was part of the decadence of liberal democracies in the West. But he described transhumanism in this enterprise as a post-secular phenomenon. So what post-secularism means is that secularism, as most people probably understand, is this distinction between the religious ultimate meaning and then the sort of secular enterprise and the sort of public sphere and stuff. Well, because of whether it be postmodernism, posthumanism, or post-secularism, all these things are a collapsing of boundaries again. And so post-secularism is the collapsing of the boundary between the religious and the secular. And Habermas highlighted that what transhumanism is because of the postmodern turn, it really is a form of post-secular meaning making, which ultimately is a religious narrative. And he argued that it really is a secular faith. And multiple other academics have made this argument regarding transhumanism as a post-secular faith. Now, posthumanism is also essential, and there's kind of a couple competing schools within posthumanism. There's more of the ecological bent that's very radical in doing away with an anthropocentric view of the 21st century. And so the idea is to reorient our perception away from what benefits mankind, generally speaking, towards like the earth or nature or the cosmos or something like this. And so they are wanting to end the sort of Enlightenment project of man being the sort of measure of all things. And transhumanism, though posthuman, because they want to sort of transcend the limits of biology, they do compete with these people, because many of these transhumanisms, like Max Moore and Natasha Vita-Moore and Nick Bostrom, they're very outspoken of how much they disdain postmodernism, because they view themselves as these sort of technological scientists, philosophers that are highly rational, that are actually doing real things in the world with their research, compared to these postmoderns. So transhumanism believes that it is the sort of epitome of the Enlightenment project. They are the endpoint of the Enlightenment. And so they're very clear, Max Moore and Nick Bostrom, that they are sort of the fulfillment of man as the measure of all things. And that transhumanism then is the ability to transcend biological constraints. And that leads into, then, if you transcend biological constraints, that leads into one of the other pillars, which is post-evolution, that they believe that of course, they're very Darwinian Wallace theory, evolutionarily oriented in their mindset, but they believe that by transcending biology, they're going to transcend the selective pressures of evolution itself, which is for them a sort of spiritual transcendence. It's a release from the suffering and the constraints of the world. And that all, then how is that accomplished? That comes to this fourth pillar of Dataism. It's about the processing and ciphering and understanding of information, which really is, I would argue, a sort of a Gnostic core to transhumanism, although they would certainly not explain it that way. But I would argue that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, I was thinking too, a lot of the essays that I wrote some years back, and I remember writing about the overlaps between, even though there was some disagreement between Gnostics and Plotinus, the basic idea here is that we're escaping this world, escaping this reality to go back to the source, the one, the monad, the unity, or whatever. So what a lot of the transhumanist ideas have done in regard to things like the metaverse and where they want to take us with this idea of the matrix is to really put that into the here and the now in a technological sense. So even though they may not believe in an afterlife or a higher transcendent reality, the idea is we can put man into his own sort of virtual God world of his own. It makes me think of that movie, The Cell, with Jennifer Lopez, where she goes into this the mind of this serial killer, and in that world, he's sort of his own God, and he wants to be worshipped in that virtual world. I think that's the ultimate offer here for the breaking down of all boundaries is, well, what if you could be the God of your own virtual mental world? Wouldn't you want to live in that world and not in this world? So they're really sort of offering this divided fake simulacrum as a pseudo heaven, you could say, almost. Would you agree with that? Right. That's really where why they're pushing a lot of the brain chips and the virtual reality where they want to take things.
And you brought up Baphomet too, which again, the most tracings of the historicity of sort of veneration of Baphomet kind of goes back to the Knights Templars, which, when we look at Giacomo Fiore, his mentor was Bernard of Clairvaux, who is by many considered the sort of spiritual father of the Templars. And the Templars, I've done research looking into esoteric spirituality and the sort of mystery schools, and they participated in very interesting homoerotic initiation ceremonies for the Templars. And they were a reviving of Gnosticism, generally speaking. So when you look at this ultimate transcendence and gaining and attaining many of these divine qualities like omnipotence, omnipresence. Omnipresence is one that Ray Kurzweil is very interested in regards to the sort of digital interconnecting of all mankind, that essentially then we become one man or one entity around the world. And because of that, then we have attained the sort of divine ability of omnipresence. And then obviously through the AI and that becoming essentially your brain, you're going to have omnipotence. And this is for them always the sort of smashing together of opposites. This is the way in which they view this sort of Neoplatonic presupposition of unity over multiplicity, that they worship unity. And I think from a spiritual perspective, it becomes that they worship themselves, as you highlighted. So you're only one person. And I think it's subtle, but it's an important point to make, that because they worship themselves, they tend to worship pure unity or pure monad. Yeah. And I think this could be characterized in regards to the New Age religion, various forms of Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, but transhumanism, I would say, is characterized by the same thing.
Yeah, the speaking of the Huxleys, I mean, Aldous Huxley's book, Perennial Philosophy, says that we need to concoct or sort of create the religion of the future of the world technocratic order. And he says that what it needs to be is some kind of ultimate big blob where everybody just worships collectivity in some generic monadic sense. And the purpose is more of a geopolitical strategic agenda of control than it is some sort of, well, we really want to see people be enlightened. I mean, no. If you go listen to the clip of Terence McKenna on YouTube, I think when I found this clip, it really showed me everything about Terence McKenna. It's look up the clip where it's the discussion of what the mushroom said to me. And it's not what you think, because he says, well, when I spoke to the mushroom told me that we don't need less brown people in third world countries. It's the white soccer moms that need to stop having babies because it's killing the planet. So he literally says that we need to stop having white kids because that's what's killing the planet. So there's a geopolitical strategic agenda behind this. Same thing if you listen to, I remember years ago listening to Manly P. Hall's lectures on esoterica and astrology. And the last lecture of that whole series was him saying, oh, by the way, the purpose of all this is that we need a socialist world government led by the United Nations. So we're not getting esoteric mysteries. We're getting a geopolitical agenda of a one world government and technocratic agenda. I think the same thing is going along with the transhumanists who want to promote things like collectivism, New Age, all this, so that everybody can be merged into the hive mind.
Right. Absolutely. And, we kind of mentioned some of these early players in regards to setting the foundation for transhumanist thought. And I'd like to just mention one further connection that I think is really interesting in regards to how they understood mechanical technology as the extension of divinity. And so we highlighted in the 800s, John Scotus Erigena. Then we talked about Giacomo Fiore, and his dates are 1135 to 1202. Then we get Roger Bacon into the 13th century. Then Henry Cornelius Agrippa. This is after the Italian Renaissance. This is after the translation of the Hermetic corpus, which was deemed by Cosimo de' Medici more important than Plato at that time, even though Latin in the West didn't have a full reading of Plato. And he has a quote that it was precisely this power over nature which Adam had, lost by original sin, but which the purified soul, the magician, could now regain. And he highlighted this in the 16th century, and this was sort of echoed by Paracelsus. Both of those individuals were followers of Giacomo Fiore. They're called Jacomite prophecies or Jacomites, who followed this idea that technology was going to gain the capabilities of God, and this was the point of mankind. Francis Bacon then also echoes this, but the book that Francis Bacon has called The New Atlantis, one of the things that's really interesting, it's subtle, but it has a lot of symbolism related to the Rosicrucians, who also had the same idea in their esoteric spirituality that they were going to blend Protestant Christianity, Hermetic, magical, esoteric, Kabbalistic ideas with science and technology itself to create utopia, because the millennium was at hand, because they also believed in the prophecies of Giacomo Fiore. And so you see books like Thomas More. He has a book called Utopia. Tommaso Campanella has one called The City of God, which literally enshrined the worship of science and technology for the social and moral perfection of man. And then you look into the 17th century with Johann Andreae, who was a alchemist, esoteric thinker. He claims that he wrote The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, the foundation.
He's in the Lutherans.
Yeah, and he wrote a book that was again utopianistic called Christianopolis, which literally, and this is what I think is so interesting, he argues that mechanical technology was the way that man's soul would unfold itself. So man's soul and his image of God, his divinity, would unfold itself through technology, therefore making technology the sort of ladder that we're going to climb out of the detritus that we're in. And so we see then, and you've mentioned this before about the Royal Society, but the Rosicrucians had the concept of the invisible college, and this actually was the precursor, and many scholars have argued, the foundation for the actual Royal Society itself, that the Rosicrucian manifestos and many of these manuscripts were saying that there was this invisible college that was already underway, that these men were working to manifest this thing, and then it connected to the Royal Society, I think is really interesting.
It is, yeah. Hegel plays a key role in that too, because Hegel's Hermetic philosophy talks about everything sort of gradually converging into pure spirit, which is the idea of transcending physicality and bodily limitations. My books, you can get those at Jay's Analysis, signed copies. If you find today's topics interesting, there's my philosophy book deals with that. And then follow David Patrick Harry over on Twitter and on YouTube, Church of the Eternal Logos. Thank you for